Hello everybody, this is Gray over at Wakizashi's Teahouse in Japan. How are you doing? Are you good? Are you Genki? I've got Jim Werner with me from Weird Times Comics. How are you doing, Jim?
Hello. I'm not Genki yet. Oh, you always make me Genki by the end. So I'm prepared to get Genki. I'm just not there yet.
Okay, well, looking forward to it. And I tell you what, I'm really glad that we both decided to go for this, to cover this one as the next Grant Morrison. New X-Men, isn't it? Was it issue 114?
Yep,
Believe it or not, Jim,
114.
it came out in May 2001 is the cover date for that. Amazing.
It's a long time ago. It's funny because people were asking what we were going to end up covering, and we were just kind of going wacky stuff. Like, I'm not saying that New X-Men or whatever isn't wacky, but at first we were thinking we were just going to cover the stuff that, normally isn't covered as much or whatnot. And then we did Animal Man, we did Doom Patrol, and people started asking and I even saw last week people asking for Batman, which we'll probably get to eventually as well. But I think it's kind of cool to dip into something like X-Men that's a little more mainstream, even for Grant, to then get back to some of the wacky stuff later. It's a good, in between. My mind won't end up being blown completely out of shape because of Grant.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, no one near as crazy as the Invisibles or Doom Patrol. It was actually it was Grant Morrison's name that brought me to this title back in the day. I didn't even know X-Men. I didn't know them apart from the movies. That was about it, and I picked it up because of him and got into it. But I think it was my first experience of Frank Quietly's art. What do you think of his art in this, Jim?
I like Frank Quietly. At points, I told you when we first got on, the idea that he makes characters very skinny. Yeah. And I'm not so sure I love his Jean Grey in this first issue. She's not sexy, as I'd say, not to try to get canceled or anything, but she ends up just really, really thin. And the way that he makes faces a lot of times, they have that weird, I can't even say it's like a Cabbage Patch doll type deal. It's a weird deal, right? So when you first see her, it's like she actually has she has the body of Jean, but a face that's for a 60-year-old. She looks kind of very
Sometimes
old.
She looks like an old woman, doesn't she?
Yeah, she looks like an old woman with a wig on, is what it looks like. I'm like, oh, man. But again, that's just an aside deal because some of the things in this look fantastic, look incredible. So that kind of outweighs the idea that I don't think Jean's sexy enough. And even when I said to you on the cover, when you first look, you end up having Emma's on the cover. She's not in this book, or issue. She might weigh 13 pounds. Somebody needs to get her a sandwich. I mean, thinner than thin is. I mean, so crazy in that, but pretty cool though. And it's funny when you end up doing these things. It's a cover that I've seen 10 trillion times. And I knew this was, the Grant Morrison X-Men, but because before I ended up hooking up with you here for this podcast, I didn't really read a lot of Grant Morrison. I didn't seek it out because a lot of the stuff that I'd been reading was just too wacky for me. I think needed to wait for you to now jump in because when people were suggesting some things and I started looking up some stuff and I'm like, okay, there's a lot of other Grant Morrison stuff that gets pretty wacky out there still that we'll probably touch on later. But I ended up check out this X-Men because people had been asking. And I read it the other day and I'm like, man, this is pretty good. So then I said, hey, do you want to do this? And I said, it's up to you. And you said, yeah, we'll do it. And here we are. So I'm pretty excited because it is something that a lot of people seem to really love, right?
Yeah, I remember at the time there was a lot of hype, before it came out. But I've also heard over the years, even Grant Morrison interviews saying that he used to get a lot of criticism from X-Men fans, especially long-term fans who weren't happy with the way he was writing it at the time. I don't know if that's changed him over time,
Yeah, I hear a lot of people. Ruben, who is a Grant Morrison fan, he loves it. He's all fired up. He can't wait.
Cool.
And as an aside, he said it's good that you're doing the X-Men right now because when you get back to Invisibles, it gets real wacky again. So I'm like, all right, here we go. But this is really good. And anything else about it that you want to touch on before we head in?
No, just to say, I've not given the credits, have I? Sorry. Of course, it's Grant Morrison who's writing it, Frank Quietly on art. It's got inks by Tim Townsend, it says here, and colours by Brian Haberlin. So this was back in the day, again, 2001. It brought me back to Marvel Comics. It got me to try out the X-Men. And yeah, think that's about it. But as you say, iconic cover.
Yeah, and that's crazy. And the idea, like you said, you jumped into the X-Men with this. I've never really read a lot of X-Men. I tried to get in the Hickman, Hawks, Pox, the Krakoan thing. I ended up going on to the first Hellfire Gala. That lost me. Usually I love a fashion show, but I had already had enough. And it was one of those plays where I was even doing an X-Men podcast myself then. And I ended up getting to that point where I disliked more than I liked. And I started thinking to myself, well, why am I doing this? Nobody wants to hear me get on and bitch and moan about all these books and whatnot. So I stopped doing that. So going into this, because back in the day, I watched the movies. I thought they were great. At one point, I tried. It was weird. I ended up, I think it was like an Office Max that I was at the one time. And they had a CD of all like the classic X-Men comics. It was this weird play, and I thought, well, that's neat. You end up getting the CD. It had like 300 X-Men comics starting from number 1. And I got it, and I read like 1.5 issues because, back in the day, things that I wasn't reading comics at that point. Kind of got bored and never did it, and I lost that CD. It'd be kind of funny to pull it up. So I never really read any X-Men. So I was afraid going into this that I was going to be a bit lost, especially because we said it's 114. This makes it the new X-Men because of Grant, but it's not a new number 1. It ends up with that numbering. And so I was worried that I would be lost, and I wasn't lost at all. There's some things that I was confused about because when we do these things, sometimes you're worried like a character shows up and you don't know if that character just showed up or if the character is somebody that was around for a while. So there's that little bit. But I think Grant does a good job of just going with, what people know and then changing it a bit and, going forward with it because you do have classic stuff and you start out with Scott and Logan, Wolverine and Cyclops just blasting the crap out of a Sentinel, and it's classic Sentinel in Australia with this crazy guy like underneath the hand. And it's a pretty cool start where I'm like, all right, I know Wolverine, I know Cyclops, I've seen Sentinels, so let's go. And Grant uses this to then continue on because this is like an issue of evolution of things and even the talk of a lot more, a baby boom of mutants, a lot of things going on here. But I'll go with you because where it could be confusing, the next page, because you turn from there and you're like, okay, this is classic. You turn and then it gets a little wacky, but not that wacky. You get the idea of what's happening. You're confused, but you still see what's happening because basically it's the age-old mutants suck and they're going to take over and we have to stop it kind of deal, but in a neat way, right?
Yeah. We go back, was it 30,000 years earlier, and we see the Homo sapiens Neanderthals versus, Homo sapiens sapiens. And it's not pretty, is it, Jim? What's weird is we've got two characters here. I mean, these were new to me. I'm sure the same for you, who are kind of watching this. So you get the impression, okay, they're not actually there, are they? They're probably watching this through a computer or something.
Yeah. You get like it's a VR.
Yeah.
I didn't know who the woman was. It is a Miss Nova. This becomes a character that's really kind of neat as a Grant Morrison kind of deal when this ends up working out. We won't go too into it to ruin it, but I did even say like the idea where this character, giving like a little bit, hey, this is what happens. These are our ancestors. The Neanderthals get wiped out by the Homo sapiens. And then she mentions Trask, says Mr. Trask. And I even recognize that name as well. The name of Trask with the whole, anti-mutant thing. And
That's
so
right.
You're wondering what's going on. And he keeps saying, though, I'm just a dentist. So that's kind of a cool thing. So then you're like, okay, well, this isn't, Bolivar Trask, who is mentioned. That ends up, your relative Bolivar, he did this and that, and it's the Sentinel program. But in that, you even like funny things, because this is like a VR, almost like the future of what museums I always thought would end up, where you'd go in a museum, put on the VR and get to see these. But at one point, they're like cannibals, and he's like, I don't think they were cannibals. Hey, what do you know? And he ends up, I saw a documentary. And it's just this weird back and forth, but basically says within 4 generations, we're going to be wiped out. The Homo sapiens superiors, the the mutants. They're going to end up taking over. They're going to wipe us out. And if you have been reading any sort of X-Men, of any, you understand that that's what always ends up being happening. The other side is against the X-Men. They say, oh my God, the mutants are going to take over, all that stuff going on. And you end up, though, like, well, what is going on with this? What's going on with Trask? What's going on with this lady? Who is it? And it's very neat and intriguing the way it goes. And I will tell you that at points you do cut around a bit in this issue, but the pacing is really good. Sometimes that sort of thing ends up feeling jarring or it throws you off. It doesn't here. It ends up being pretty good. You get full, complete, even one-page type scenes, and then you move on to the deal because you kind of want to see the X-Men, see what's going on with this new deal. And after that, basically, again, this Miss Nova says, we need to exterminate the mutant germline once and for all. Humanely, of course, she says. And while they're standing in a VR of just the destruction of the Homo sapien Neanderthals, and then you end up with Trasco. But Miss Nova, I'm only a dentist, and you move on. It's kind of that funny type of deal, but not trying to be like, it's not stand-up joke material. It's just funny because of the situation. And actually, I really like that opening. And then you have a pretty cool credits page where you end up seeing. Yeah,
it's a great credits page. But you like you were just saying about that scene of carnage, but you've got Grant. He's not making like jokes of the scene, but he can still make a joke. He can make it funny by what Trask is saying. I do like that balance where he does that. But yeah, the next page we get a great double page spread, don't we? We see a kind of introduction to the team. We've got Scott Summers, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Emma Frost, who's not here yet, but she will be, Henry McCoy as the Beast, and Logan Wolverine. That's it.
It's
For Extinction.
Yeah, and then you go into, the Institute, and you see that Beast. And this is the thing that, again, because I hadn't been reading, and we're just jumping in, Beast is, in a way, like, that is actually the Beast that I'm kind of used to, especially because I'm thinking about the movies and, the whole Kelsey Grammer and stuff like that.
Oh, he was so cool, wasn't he, in that part?
He was awesome. I love that. And so they do mention, though, in here, and he mentions, but again, it's not like through a narration, placard type thing. It's just Beast saying, listen, I'm kind of getting used to these hands, the way that they're, getting more feral. You have Jean mention it, like all this stuff where he is becoming more of the Beast, but he's still, Henry. So he ends up where he made this new Cerebra. He ended up making a upgrade of Cerebro. And I like where it's like Jean doesn't know too much about it, so you kind of introduce it through her, like, oh, this is just this, pretty much it's an amplified version of Cerebro. But even them, like the idea that Grant has Hank say, hey, listen, I hope that the helmet doesn't rip your earlobes off. I'm trying to work with these hands. At one point he says, once I remember how to use a pen again, I'll write some notes down. Like there's some good stuff there. Also, just a little aside where you have Jean say, hey, do you want a soda? And you end up having Hank's like, yeah, diet, please. And she's like, diet? You wait. So it's a neat way to give you that, info of the character. Like, oh, you weigh 600 pounds. He's like, yeah, but again, it's kind of funny. Yeah, but I don't want to get fat. He's not spelling it
out, is he? He's not like, going over the top with it. It's good. It's the way he introduces it, like, very cleverly.
Exactly. So that's why I never felt lost. And he says, I'm becoming more, and it's good, I suspect my latest Beast form, because he does go through that back and forth with it. He says, I think it's connected to this year's mutant baby boom. So you get the info that he's more feral in this than he's been. So there's info for me. Then you also get that there's a baby boom, and that's kind of why they have Cerebra. There's a lot of these new mutants coming, and they're going to need people to go and help them out. That's the whole Professor X thing. Also, through this, you find out through dialogue again that Professor X hasn't been doing that much lately. No. It seems that you get that play of he's kind of, inspired. And even Jean says he's kind of manic inspired. Like, this isn't just, hey, like, he is full blown out. He's spending tons of money on new stuff. He's getting everybody in. They have new uniforms, all that stuff. Pretty cool way to start it out, especially again, because it's a 114 and you might have been worried that you'd have to have a lot of background going in, but you really don't. It really does play out really well. the way that's going. And as we say this, we said we started out where Cyclops, Wolverine, they're in Australia. They're actually coming back. So they're not at the Institute yet. It's just,
that's right.
It's Beast, Jean, and in the Cerebro, you have Professor X. And again, I love the dialogue between Jean and Beast. It's that friends, but also like family type feel with them. And it's such a natural type, kind of ribbing each other at points. They even apologize at one point to Xavier, like, you know how we get when we're around each other, which I like. And really, it also shows you the idea, because it is kind of a loving type of dialogue. Like I said, it's like a brother-sister type thing. While we'll be getting Wolverine and Scott, they don't ever get, they're always yelling and screaming at each other. But
they're always fighting, aren't they? They just don't get along, do they? Kind of like rile each other up. And you can tell that Logan, Wolverine, he loves doing that, doesn't he? He loves to get under Scott's skin. And Scott's kind of like, is he the straight man in this? I'm never quite sure.
Yeah, he kind of is, yeah. And they also, there's that weird play that Hank mentions it. And then also you end up having Wolverine but they don't fully, but it's that there might be trouble in paradise with Scott and Jean. They might not be getting along. It's hinted that there are some problems. And again, Wolverine mentions it as like kind of a dig. Like he kind of like, digging in. Hank seems like he's kind of, concerned. Hey, what's going on? Jean doesn't want to talk about it. She like pushes that aside. But you go from there, because then you get, and I really like that look where you have Xavier. He's in Cerebra. It's this, new thing amplified, but it looks evil at first, because he's there, like his big head looking at, it's the United States and South America right there. But it looks like he's like an evil giant, thing as he does this, because it is kind of creepy a bit overall. But
some kind of huge god, looking down on the earth, isn't it? It's so cool.
Yeah, it is. And he's looking. And you go from there, because then they see like a spike, or at least Hank does, right?
It's on, was it? So it's basically Cerebra's showing the map of the United States, and there's all these little like small white lights showing mutants, I think, who are either being born or who are appearing or existing. And then there's a spike, isn't there, Jim? Some kind of weird spike that only Beast seems to notice. He's like, what's that big one? Use the zoom. I saw an enormous spike in South America, which is setting up what's to come, isn't it?
Yeah, and I thought it was pretty cool because you actually see it. I'm glad that, Frank quietly has that there. You see this.
Yes, in that center panel.
The line is really shooting up. And I'm like, oh my God, what was that? And Jean and Xavier, they don't see it. Or they
both
don't
miss it, don't they? Yeah, that's so weird.
And you do have at one point, Xavier says that he trusts Beast's, senses and all that. So he ends up going with that. They're going to have to check this out. But it's also like showing, and even that Jean's looking and says, look at the world. There are so many mutants out there, Hank. Oh, my God. And you end up where Xavier says more and more of us all the time. I wonder what it means. And the whole play of this, again, is they need to, kind of help some of these and kind of see. But the spike is crazy. And I love the idea that you end up mentioning Scott and Logan, and then you actually do see the X-Wing, as they call flying there.
I thought that was a joke. It's like the X-Wing, like, no way.
Yeah, I thought it was too. And I'm like, okay, it works, I guess. And there was one point, I always bring this up, where in a Harley Quinn book, she ended up where she was almost gathering up an X-Men team. She was like gathering up a deal. And they had a jet. And I said, like, the Quinn jet was...
The Quinn jet.
That's so easy to... They didn't call it that. They called it something stupid. I'm like, why didn't you call it the Quinjet? It was the easiest thing. And so when I go to this and I see X-Wing, I'm like, oh, okay, X-Wing. I kind of laughed at that. Like you said, I thought that it might have been a bit of a joke as well. And you go into the cockpit here, and that's where we see Ugly John, this guy with three faces. I love the guy's name Steve, but his mates call him Ugly John.
Yeah, it sounds like so Australian. You can imagine the accent, Steve, but my mates call me Ugly John, Jim, have you noticed as well, that is it Logan in the background who appears to be smoking? He's holding a can of Castlemaine 4X, which is apparently, it's a famous Aussie lager, but when I went to Australia, all the Aussies were like, oh, mate, we don't drink that. We just sell that to the Poms, to the English.
That's just to the English, the people going there. That's pretty good.
Oh, no.
Oh, my. So it is funny because he is smoking. And that, again, Grant's having some fun where Scott says, listen, Logan, no smoking in the jet. You have a healing factor. We all work on lungs. Come on. He's like, listen, I can't help it. You see, he's just on fire.
Yeah.
And if you do go back, because when you did have that first scene, he was on top of the beheaded at that point Sentinel, and he was just going to town on it. And things were going all crazy. And yeah, he was on fire, and he still is. Kind of a funny deal as he's pulling bullets out of his skin and his neck and all this awful stuff. But they do mention that these Sentinels that they're fighting, that they're like, oh man, these things are old. Like, we should be done with these. I think that we ended up like, these are going to be some of the last ones. Eventually, we'll get through them, and this will be cool. And even says these are kind of easy to take down, even because they're so old. They run. He goes through the idea of how they're put together and what they're made of, and whether or not it's true or if he's making fun of it. Where the whole play of Wolverine saying it, they are like just scrapped together old Sentinels, which is part, everything sets up what's coming up as well. But I do like Steve Ugly John, who's just like, man, you guys are the good-looking ones, right? I like Wolverine's
That's a great line.
It's nice that you noticed. And like, this guy's so ugly. Look at that guy with these three faces.
I tell you, Jim, I was getting like flashbacks to Judge Dredd and the Cursed Earth. He looks like a character from one of those comics, doesn't he?
Yeah,
it's really weird.
I'm telling you, I even thought of like R's face at one point for some reason, but also felt like it also would have fit in the Doom Patrol, which makes sense because of the whole connection of that. But yeah, this guy just there is just funny, just to be there to get a little bit of information and pass out. And he the worst is he seems to be injured. They end up saying, at one point, Wolverine says, why are we taking this schmuck back with us? And Scott says, well, there's not really doctors in Australia that are going to be able to treat a three-faced guy, a mutant. We're going to have to help him. But then they don't take him back. They end up, because they're diverted, to go to Ecuador.
Right, to investigate that spike. Yeah.
And I guess he wasn't too hurt. Like, maybe they should go back quick. I mean, they're in the jet. Maybe they could go back to, Westchester and then go off. But I like where Ugly John's like, can I call my mates? Well, I think we're in space, though, right? And then passes out. So that's where you do have that dialogue, though, with Wolverine, hey, we'll just get going. This is whatever. And, you get that back and forth with Scott. Eventually it'll get more, because that's when Xavier will call them into the mine to discuss what they have to do. And that's pretty cool. Even
that's
before
a cool
that,
scene,
though,
isn't it? Later on, yeah.
I think we have the best art coming up, because you end up where this whole Trask, the dentist, and Miss Nova, they are being flown somewhere, and this whole play where Trask doesn't understand really why he's involved.
No, he doesn't yet, does he?
Yeah, and it seems like Miss Nova ended up telling him, oh, this is a government thing. At one point he mentions that he thought he was supposed to be giving a dictator like a root canal. Like it was Black Ops root canal. He says he kind of realizes that might not be it, but after that whole VR, whether he's upset because he saw people eating babies and things. I mean, it was a horrific scene.
It was a horrible scene at one point.
He might also be sick from flying in the helicopter. That combination. He takes off his VR helmet and throws up in it.
And Cassandra says, very poetic, Mr. Trask. And then we hear about the connection you were saying. Like, she says, it's your uncle, Bolivar. He built the first of the old Sentinels, isn't that right? The whole time, like, Trask is just puking up and he's not talking, is he?
Yeah, he's just puking. And then he kind of like, well, that's not what I do. I'm a dentist. I'm Albuquerque, pretty successful. I don't understand. Why am I here? You said I was doing this and that. And then you have Cassandra Nova say, we're here. We're at a basic master mold factory. It was constructed during a lull in the fighting, all these things in the jungles of Ecuador. And what it's doing is it just keeps going. It's actually been working, and it just grabs whatever resources it can and makes Sentinels.
It's building wild Sentinels. It's a great line there. Yeah.
We just went from the idea that, Scott and Logan were kind of almost like making fun of the Sentinels. Like, oh, these Sentinels, they're so old. We go in, I'm kind of getting sick of this. I hope we're done with them. And then you get to a point where, oh no, like there's going to be new ones coming. And you keep jumping. Like I said, you jump, but the jumps are at good points. they lead to like the next deal because you end up having, Cassandra and Trask, they kind of come out of the jungle, and then there's just the coolest thing where it's just this big Master Mold factory, but it's a giant sentinel just like sitting on a throne.
How great is that scene, that art? So good.
And I like where she's talking about this whole wild sentinel Master Mold factory. It's like, yeah, it's great, this thing. And then Trask at the well, where's this? What are you talking about? Where did this happen? And he like pulls the thing. She's like, I give you one guess. It's like give you two guesses, and the first one doesn't count.
Between the trees, it's like this huge sentinels out there with the sun behind it.
Cool. It's so cool, even with like the birds flying behind it. It's done so well. And then we go to Xavier talking with Jean, Hank, Logan, and Scott about what they need to do, what they're going to go, and goes with that classic deal. I don't know that people will be wowed that Xavier says, hey, mutants are treated like crap, and we got to help them. We got to go do this, and goes through the deal, and it's true.
No surprises there.
And it's the idea of what the X-Men end up representing. The best and worst thing about the X-Men in my mind, because people end up saying, well, it's the metaphor for homosexuals. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for any group that gets hated on, and that's the worst. It's like the genius of it is it's universal, but the awfulness of it is it's universal because there's always going to be people hating people. So it works because even when you think of now, the idea of, hey, they get accused of stealing human jobs, eating human food, taking human partners, this is what every group ends up.
It's the old immigrants argument, isn't it? Yeah.
So it ends up being that idea that it's kind of sad that it's so universal, but it works because of that. And yeah, it's tough. So you end up where, you go through that. They're going to need teachers. We're going to set up a new school. We're going to get new recruits. We're going to have new uniforms. At one point, Logan's like, thank God, because I hate looking like an asshole.
I know, Jim, what do you think of that? That's a reference to, isn't it, to his classic costume.
I love the classic costume so much, but it is kind of ridiculous, right?
He's asking, like, I was never sure, Professor, like, why did you have us dress up like superheroes? It's so cool, isn't it? And Scott's like, he thought it was because the people would trust us, if we looked like something that they understood and not something they don't understand.
And I like Xavier's like, that's correct, Scott. Wolverine's like, every time in these situations, it is like a classroom type deal. And you got brown nose or teacher's pet Scott every time. And there's Logan who gets pissed off about it. So it's always funny in that. And I do like them just hanging out, too. It's just nice seeing them in those big chairs. Just there, Scott's
What's weird,
there.
Jim, they're having this, it's like a virtual meeting they're doing, because they're still on the plane, aren't they, to Ecuador? But they're sat on these, as kind of Matrix-style virtual sofas.
I like that, yeah.
So
I love
cool.
the background, too, with all of the calculations and all of the formulas and stuff like that. It looks really neat. And, so they're like, okay, well, we're going to make things better. We're going to encourage people to trust mutants. And the idea, too, where Scott did mention, too, that people were trying to kill, old Ugly John.
Poor Ugly John. He was being hunted, apparently, wasn't he? That was crazy.
Yeah. And Wolverine brings it up, hey, said we're Xavier wants to, again, he wants to not just separate the X, he wants people to accept them. And we got to do this. And we got to teach these kids, though, to be able to, meld in with things and whatnot. And you end up having Wolverine say, yeah, tell that three-faced kid that we got in the X-Wing now. I love when he calls him Chuck, too. That always makes me giggle. It reminds me of Charlie Brown. That's what it does. But you end up where all this going down, they have to go to Ecuador. We're going to go to Ecuador. Scott says, no problem. Again, I thought that kid was hurt, but they're going to go off there. Pretty cool. And then when they pop out, that's where Wolverine's like, oh, yeah, you wanted to get out of there quick, right? Oh, man, you didn't like being in there because he could pry in and find out about you and Jean. And you end up where Scott, I didn't even understand fully what he meant at first until then Scott said, by the way, me and Jean are perfectly happy, so that it all makes sense. But I like that he says that as they are heading to Ecuador. Then you go to Hank and Jean, and he says it to her like, oh, man, are things okay? It doesn't seem crazy, as they're kind of in this weird. This is a weird play where Beast has made a thing where he can magnify things so much to check out human DNA samples and things, and they're just walking through.
I love the line he gives her here, Gene, where he says, like, listen, Gene, I hate to pry, but I was practically picking the atmosphere out of my fur during that briefing. That's so cool.
And you know what's the weird thing about it is? There was nothing really said. I think that the issue is that they're sitting there and Jean was there, like with her legs crossed, but her arms crossed as well. Didn't say anything really.
No, they weren't talking, were they?
They didn't even say hello. And at one point, when you end up where Scott says, ignore Logan, Professor Xavier, afterwards, no problem. Jean looks like she is shooting like daggers.
She's giving him a glare stare, isn't she? Oh my gosh.
The stick guy is bad. So again, I like the idea that it plays off that if me and you were in the room, we probably wouldn't have known anything, but they're so close.
They're so close. They can pick up on it. Yeah.
Yeah. The idea that Jean didn't say, oh, Scott, how you doing? They didn't sit together. He's standing there. It's a weird play there as well. It's just very odd.
Definite atmosphere.
And she tries to push that away as well and said, hey, and then even then talking about everything going on with death and failure and the mutants and how Xavier's going manic with this stuff. And it is funny where you have this moment where Logan has been saying, I like that Logan's the one who has like the philosophical stuff to both Jean.
Rare sensitive moment.
Yeah, they're actually repeating like, Logan said that he's trying to give all those deaths and failures meaning again, polishing up his dream until it shines. Well, at least that's what Logan said. And then Jean's like, oh man, that's what Logan said to me too. And it's so funny. The idea that you have off-panel philosophical Logan talking about Xavier, but again, shows that everybody here knows each other so well.
But then she you see Jean, she's clutching her head here, Jim, and she's like, oh, are you okay, Jean? You're having one of your embarrassing psychic moments. And she's like, no, I just felt something odd. It's fine.
Because what she says is pretty much what I said to Logan. So again, it was Logan passing on the info that Jean said to him, but says, which is pretty much what I said to Logan when we talked about it. Said Logan, too did you, and then Beast, what happened? What's going on?
Whoa,
because this sounds like she's having a stroke.
Her language went all over the place. Yeah,
and then she's like, "Oh my god," and I like that he says, "Yeah, I'm one of your embarrassing psychic moments."
Yeah, it's a funny
she's
line.
like, "No, something's out. I felt something," and goes running off. And you see Xavier is having problems, and then somebody is talking in the head through Cerebra to him. What I like about it is you could play this where, was this Miss Nova? Was it? It is. And Grant Morrison shows you it is. I like the idea that there's no we'll play this mystery for a little and we'll go, no, he wants you to know exactly who it is, because as this is going on, you have some big things where, hey, Charles, it's me again.
It's funny that, isn't it? That really caught my eye, like, hello again, Charles. Because that's, as far as we know, this is the first we've heard, that she's contacting him. But obviously there's something going on in the past there. It's reference anyway.
Yep. And then even the other, as it's just taunting him, saying, oh, look at a crippled boy. It's almost like you can get around now with this thing. That's crazy. But then starts saying things like, I am what's eating your mind. I'll be you now and make you a murderer, Charles. Then says the first and oldest and the last enemy.
And he's getting a nosebleed. You can see he's in pain. He's struggling. He's fighting it, isn't he?
Yep. And says the terror and hate you thought would never return. Charles' big ugly secret. The nightmare on the dark side of your dreams. Surrender, Charles. And that's where Jean's ripping Cerebra off of him, trying to get that off. And even at one point, he puts a gun up to his head and I'll kill myself. I'll just shoot myself if you don't stop this. And then
get out of my head or I'll fire.
Yeah, really. And Jean, and his nose is bleeding. Jean rips Cerebra helmet off of him, and he's out of it. He is hurt. He's bleeding. And then you go back to Ecuador, where Cassandra Nova is also bleeding of the nose and wipes the blood off, which is great connection.
Yeah, well done.
And it just says, because, they're walking towards the Master Mold deal and says, what happened? I was miles away.
Yeah,
They're like, oh my God. So I love the idea where the mystery isn't, oh my God, who's in his brain? Who's in his brain? The mystery is, the hell is this? The idea of this is the first, oldest, and last enemy? really, like, who is this and what does this mean and whatnot? That's real intriguing about what this could mean and what it would be. And then even then, when you start, you're like, this lady does look like Xavier a bit.
She does it, yeah. That's Frank Quietly Czar, I'm not sure. But yeah, I like the way they did that, Jim. You got that link,
especially at the end, she has like a pit helmet on. She takes it off, and you're like, holy crap, it's like a female Xavier.
Yeah.
So that's a big play. But they're going down to the factory, and you end up Trask still doesn't understand why he's involved.
No, I like the fact that, she's just had a huge psychic battle with Charles, which he doesn't know about, and he's complaining about being bitten by insects and stuff. What am I doing here?
This sucks. This is the worst. So they go down, and you have like what looks like soldiers out, and the idea you're not here for your dentistry, all this. We have what you see starting up. You don't see them right away, but these are these wild sentinels, and they just destroy these soldiers.
It's so good how they don't really show it, do they? They kind of half show it, but it's half left to our imagination, but something horrific happens.
And you end up where Trask is like, because you see them lined up, they're there, not really anything else. Also, just to point out, the idea that this Master Mold factory is using everything they get to, you do see, like, a plane there, like, ripped apart. You end up seeing a lot of cars. It looks like, we're down south and everybody has their car in their front yard. Everything's ripped apart.
That's right.
A little shout out.
It's like a junkie.
Yeah. And so it does make sense that it's grabbing stuff and whatever it can get. Now, you wonder at this point, like, what can it really grab in the middle of the jungle in Ecuador? But hey, it seems to be working things out that way. And so this all goes, these soldiers just get destroyed. And you end up having Trask like, oh my God, again, now he's seeing more people get killed. This is real. This isn't crazy VR. And then me and you both did the same. I think most people would do the same exact thing, because Nova says, don't worry about them. They were dead. I was actually, and again, showing you, okay, like, just imagine this. We got to kill all the mutants, right? Oh, these mutants, they're the worst. They're going to take over Forge. And oh my God. And now we see that this Cassandra Nova mind powers to go into the whole mind of, Xavier. You get the idea that the spike in the whole thing is her. And also, she's got a power to animate and control dead bodies. Like, she's a mutant. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. And yet she wants to kill them and set this whole thing up. And it's crazy because the idea that these Sentinels, what's going on? And I think that Trask even thinks it too, because at one point he says, why aren't they killing you? They're supposed to kill mutants. So what are you? That's the crazy thing about it.
You're getting a hint of how powerful she probably is, or how she's going to be, aren't you? It's like, oh my God, who is this woman?
These wild sentinels, in my mind, what she needs is somebody that's a Trask. She says, you better say something or they're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And he ends up like, no, don't hurt me. In the name of God, stop. And they're like, recognize Trask, protect Trask. That's what they're made for. The whole idea is they are supposed to preserve the Trask DNA. And she obviously, at the point of this, she needs him to be able, because he's going to be able to tell them what to do. She even says, now you're going to be able to tell them all what's happening. Dear old Uncle Bali set this up, and I'm going to need you to send
Uncle
these
Bali.
things out. We're going to continue. Yeah, it's so funny. And says, with the word, you can extend their reach. With the word, you can exterminate Homo superior in its infancy, while the species is still too young to fight back. So lower that once commanding voice of yours a few octaves. I never got that he had any sort of command. He seems like a weird, scared guy. Right?
Just a bumbling fool.
She says at one point he either crapped or pissed himself. She says,
God.
That must be your famous, charming, captivating wit running down your leg into your shoes right now. like, I don't see that cat. But he actually says they're not attacking you. And that's like the weird play of like, why aren't they? That is weird.
Yeah.
So, and then says, forget your dental practice, Mr. Trash. Your future lies in genocide. And then you see these wild sentinels. That one on the track it's got the craziest look, the way it has. And I'm like, would somebody want that as a action figure? Because it's so horrific, but it might be pretty cool, right?
It's kind of cool as well, isn't it, Jim? Yeah, it's like a mix of a cobra or something as well. It looks so weird.
It's like a cobra, cool. But then it has like almost like a spider type. It's odd. It's got big guns, though. And then
Gundam
you have these
style.
little guys, yeah. And you have these little guys going with their big butt engines. It's kind of cool. But yeah, these are obviously, when you see that big, giant Cobra-looking thing, you're like, okay, well, I see. It's not an old Sentinel. Like, holy moly. She even says when Noah comes out and you end up seeing that whole Master Mold factory, she does kind of like reminisce, like, look at the classic look. Because it's that big Sentinel. Like, it's real cool looking, but we're upgrading things. Again, it's neat to have it in the jungle. It almost plays out that idea where they even say, like, in the Amazon, say, like, there's insects that we've never even seen before. There's this and that. So it's kind of a neat deal in Ecuador here where you end up having these wild sentinels being built, and that's where that issue ends. Pretty good. It's one of those things where not much action. You basically have a lot of talking, but yet Grant does it so well. And the Frank Quietly art so well that I think that I really liked it. How about you?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was great to come back to this and reread it after so many years away. And just to see, I wonder like how it will be, because I'm like you, Jim, I don't know that much about the X-Men, apart from basic things, but within these two new characters, well, three, if you include Ugly John, who can forget him? I as you said, they have the voices. He has the voices, isn't he? Grant has the voices down. They sound like the characters, and then that final panel reveal where you see the woman take a pith helmet off, and it looks like a female version of Charles Xavier. That's a great link there. So, man, are we talking scores?
Yeah, what would your score be?
I'm going to go 9.5, 9.5.
I'm going 9.5 too. I almost could go up to 9.8. I liked it that much, but because you're kind of like settling in, and I will mention too, the reason I know how much I liked it is when I read this issue, and we didn't even decide yet that we were going to do this today. I read the next two. So I actually read the three.
Oh, have you read them? Okay,
I read them in one sitting. I usually don't,
nice.
because I didn't know that we were going to do it. So I was just like, I want to see what's going on. I will tell everybody that the Frank Quietly makes the characters a little sexier in the next deal, especially Logan. At one point, Logan, I'm like, holy moly. And it's funny because when you end up having Ugly John say, oh, you're the good-looking ones. First off, at that point, Wolverine was on fire.
Yeah, he was smoking, melting.
Also, I thought it was like one of those, well, Ugly John's going to think just about everybody's good-looking.
Everybody's good-looking.
Yeah, I'm telling you, he looks pretty good in that jungle coming up, and Gene starts to look a lot better, too. I think maybe he's like, all right, I'm going to get into this. Still very skinny. All of them, but pretty cool. So I do like it a lot. But with that, 9.5s for both of us. And I'm looking forward to talking about the next two, because this is a 3-issue arc we'll go through, and then we'll figure out what we're doing from there. But you take us out of here. And I am glad I ended up looking at the last video that you put up of the Invisibles. And I do appreciate that a lot of people are telling you that they are enjoying it, and also having some suggestions of stuff.
Yeah, we love getting suggestions, don't we, Jim? It's great. We'd love to hear from you.
When I saw him, like, Batman, and I looked, and you had told the person that we were going to be doing X-Men, and hopefully they're excited about that as well. But you take us out, we're done. Okay, this has been a blast revisiting this. I hope you do read along at home with us, and definitely recommend it. It's you can come into this without any previous knowledge. If you just know some of the basic things about the characters, I'm sure you have a great time. So yeah, Jim, next week it's going to be part 2 of 3, E for Extinction, and hopefully we get a bit of sexy Emma Frost in that issue. Hopefully, but we'll have that, and we'll talk to you then.